Hey everyone, I am Nisa Floyd. I'm the program coordinator for Atlanta Contemporary, and today you will hear creaking because I'm right in front of my front door. But I have the pleasure of introducing Kelly Taylor Mitchell and her studio tour. So Kelly Taylor Mitchell joined the Studio Artist Program last November, and we have just been astounded and grateful for her presence ever since. Recently, she actually was awarded the opportunity to work with Mocha GA as a part of their Working Artist project. So I'm just incredibly grateful to be able to kind of like sit here and, understand more about Kelly's practice and share that with you all. And then she will also be doing a demo to share with you all as well. If you have any questions, leave them in the chat and I'll be sure to get to them throughout the presentation. And at the very end, we'll share some time so that you can take yourself off audio and unmute yourself and all of those things. And we can kind of have a communal gathering and share some stuff. But without further ado, Kelly, take it away.
Thank you, Nisa. Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. Good morning. I have a little presentation here to walk through a few bodies of work that are in progress or upcoming. And this is my studio at the Contemporary. If I were there today, this would be my background instead of this pretty Houston garden that I am situated in at the moment. So I want to start by talking about public performance, which is sort of a new element to my practice. And as I mentioned, very much in progress. So the images that you are going to see, I really think about as an archive. They're documentation from a series of performances I did this summer. And to give you a little context, my practice is really rooted in research. I'm a papermaker, I'm a sculptor, I'm a printmaker, I'm an installation artist. I'm an interdisciplinary maker, but research always comes first. And my research comes from my grandfather. Through research that was bequeathed to me, I learned about my family's history in the Great Dismal Swamp, which, if you're not familiar, the Great Dismal Swamp straddles North Carolina and Virginia. Pictured here, this is my first visit to the swamp about 4 years ago. And I learned that the swamp, as I mentioned, is the largest maroon colony in the United States, meaning it's a territory where formerly enslaved people and indigenous people created community, economy, and autonomy, in an incredibly inhospitable landscape during enslavement. And across the diaspora, you can see maroon colonies, right? So wherever we have histories of enslavement, we have maroon colonies, or quilombos as they're called, elsewhere in the world as well. And so my practice really wanted to have me identify other places where these autonomous communities were operating. And I really wanted to identify through lines, things that they have in common. These spaces are not homogenous, despite so many of these shared experiences, but things that I have identified that are shared are ritual practices when it comes to embodiment and performance. And, performance really isn't the correct word, but it gives you a sense of sort of the ritual quality that's happening. The use and reliance on plant life, and the sort of practice of masquerading are things that we see across these autonomous spaces. And so I did a performance this summer at the Great Dismal Swamp, a series of 3 performances. The first one here is performance number 1, 2-strand twist takedown. This was my second time returning to the swamp, and the swamp has this incredible history. I mean, my grandfather grew up on a farm that my family still lives and works on. That's only 45 minutes from the swamp. And my ancestors who escaped enslavement to this very swamp, their plantation where they were enslaved on was about an hour from this swamp. So this sort of triangulation of history that my family is still sort of immersed in also amazes me. And so for this first performance, I really wanted to come with this sense of reverence. And so that's why it's a sort of preparatory performance, in the sense that I'm preparing my hair as sort of this act of respect to be able to be in that space and to sort of show that sense of reverence. And using myself, right, my body as a way to do that action. And as I mentioned, I'm thinking about these images that I'm showing you from the performance as an archive. So in other works that I'm going to show you guys, you're going to see how I'm utilizing some of these images as gel medium transfers, as source imagery for prints, so on and so forth. So Nisa mentioned that I'm an upcoming fellow for Mocha GA, and I really intend on using these performance images, among other images that I will capture in upcoming performances, as a well that I keep returning to in my practice. I really love having a generative practice that sort of feeds itself, right? It's responding to research, but it also is sort of feeding itself. And having this archive allows that. So this is performance number 2, quite literal offerings, really reflecting offerings in an altar space I keep at home, but on a little more lavish scale with all of the fruits and vegetables. Again, speaking back to that idea of reverence and respect and care. The final performance was performance number 3, bathing in Lake Drummond. Lake Drummond is the central lake in the swamp. And you see that I'm wearing this hand and beaded embroidered masks. We'll talk about those. They're really a through line through my practice. They reference back to that shared practice that I've identified, not just in the Great Dismal Swamp, but, in Quilombos in Bahia, in, Yoruba, Igangan culture, so on and so forth, where we have this masking. And what this masking does, culturally, in these different spaces, depending on that cultural context, the masking can allow the wearer to embody an orisha or a deity. It can allow the wearer to embody an ancestral force, and it can just allow sort of a bridge for ancestral connection. And that third one is what I'm most interested in, is that ancestral connection. And the reason being is in doing this research about the swamp and trying to learn about other autonomous spaces across the diaspora, I sort of hit these brick walls in my research, right? Sort of feeling limited to what's available to me in archives and libraries. And don't get me wrong, I use those space, a desolate place for a defiant people, slaveries, exiles, so on and so forth. So they're great titles that speak to these histories. But they're limited, right? And they're rooted in institutions that, practice erasure intentionally or otherwise. And so I really am working on allowing myself to feel empowered to create these histories, right? In theory, all histories are created. So why can't I speculate my own with the help of my ancestors? And so that's how I'm thinking about the masks, as this real functional conduit to allow me to do that speculating. And so that's how I think about sort of Afrofuturism operating in my work, but looking back, right, to sort of speculate on histories and allow things to sort of interconnect and overlap that don't necessarily, interconnect and overlap in our conception of time or reality, but in my sort of universe of building this history, they are. A nice detail here of one of the masks. So I've made about 9 of these masks so far. As I've gotten more comfortable with the process, I try to get more detailed. I love that these are so labor intensive. I'm really interested in sort of subverting these art historical expectations we have when it comes to medium. And so not sort of relying on the often centered mediums in sort of the art world, so to speak, and really prioritizing craft and sort of practices of making that were passed down to me, specifically sewing. And I also see labor, since I've been talking about these masks, as functional, right? Being this conduit, I want to build mutual respect, right? I want to build intimacy with the object so it can help me do what I want it to do, serve as this sort of port for ancestral connection. And here's just a GIF from this performance. And so I took about 6 masks with me, I believe, to the Great Dismal Swamp this summer. And so I did this sort of bathing process with each mask. So I talked about how the work is generative, how I'm utilizing these images that you just saw, how I'm utilizing them in other bodies of work. So this is a body of work that just was de-installed at the Atlanta Contemporary called Because We Are Loved, Altar for the Ancestors. And those images you were just looking at, specifically performance number 2, offerings, is what I utilized to create this space. So I printed out those images, and then I mirrored my grandmother's Adirondack star quilt to create this sort of star pattern. And I had a really wonderful conversation with Nisa the other day, also sort of talking about the different reference points that stars offer us, right? It's not just about my grandmother's Adirondack star quilt, but, all the different ways that stars operate in the diaspora, even thinking about the most sort of obvious of the North Star, right? And being the sort of guiding force for enslaved peoples and all sorts of people, right? Sort of trying to find their way. And then we have Lake Drummond in the background being projected in this space. Scent and smell is a part of my work. So I also have these oranges that you can see on the bottom left-hand side of the screen that are sort of pricked with cloves to help imbue the space with this subtle scent. And it also required me to come back every week and sort of reset the space and bring in new oranges after the oranges had molded. And so I really love having elements of care and maintenance in my practice. I also think it speaks to that sort of functional element in my work and sort of it requiring this sort of activation. And I just want to clarify, I really see these sort of active elements of my work as being specific to me. I don't believe I have the prowess or the ability to make these masks for others. And it's really about me and encouraging people and reminding people that this sort of spirit work, this ancestral worship work, are things that they can do for themselves if they so choose. So I mentioned that, I went to the swamp this summer and I did this performance. That was my first time doing a quote unquote public performance. And even though I didn't have an audience, as woo-woo as it may sound, I did not feel alone, right? I had these wonderful interactions with wearing the masks and natural light that really made me feel like I was doing the right thing in the right place, and that I did have viewers, even if they weren't visible to me. But I also do a lot of private performance in my studio. And since I'm not in these charged locations like the Great Dismal Swamp, when I do private performance, I've made these sort of textile objects that I'm referred to as portals that I use when I am doing these private performances outside of these charged locations. And these are currently installed at the Atlanta Contemporary in the shoot space. So you guys can go and see it. I hope you do if you're able safely. There are about 4 of these objects in the space, along with 3 masks. You can see that in the image on the right-hand side. And these masks are directly referencing some research I've been doing into Afro-Brazilian mandingas, also known as amulets or talismans. And it's this practice of, wearing a little leather satchel around your neck, putting things in that satchel that, can draw good towards you or protect you from evil. And of course, sometimes that could be multiple objects, but it's possible that one object could sort of serve that dual purpose. And I love that idea, that sort of duality. And that's what I was thinking about in choosing my textiles. And I got these textiles from a residency at Anderson Ranch in Colorado. And it may seem like, what's the connection between, textiles from a residency and this sort of dual purpose that we're seeing in Bahia and Candomblé and the history of Afro-Brazilian mandingas? But I think they serve this purpose of really sort of drawing in all of the good, whether they're relationships, experiences, conversations that have come from my participation in artist communities, but also protecting me from the hard stuff, the violence, the erasure that I've also experienced at the same time. So that's how I'm sort of trying to speak back to that history as well. And then the adornments that I'm using on these objects, the plant life, the popcorn, the pearls, the black-eyed peas, they're all speaking back to my research, whether it relates to my immediate family or the sort of extended diasporic family that I've sort of learned about as my research continues to unfold. And so to clarify, I'm still learning. I'm not an expert in the things that I'm talking about. I'm very much in discovery mode. And I think I may always be. I really feel like in certain ways, this is sort of a life's calling, not a, temporary body of work. And then as I move into making work for the MoCA GA show next November, 2021, I'm going to continue this body of work of textile objects that you just saw, still using those textiles from the residency. However, now I am dyeing those textiles with yellow onion skin. So they're all going to be the sort of rosy brown color. And just like the objects that you just saw that are currently installed at the Contemporary, I'm doing this gel medium transfer process. You can see that in progress on the image on the right-hand side, the textile piece that's sort of undergoing the making process. And just like the installation, the first installation I showed you at the Contemporary, I'm using images for these gel medium transfers. So again, you're seeing how, even though the work is rooted in research, my practice is sort of feeding itself, right? But I also am not only going to be, using images from my performances to serve as gel medium transfers on these textiles. I'm also going to be using images from my family archive. And so these are just 2 slides from the archive. That's one of the projects that I'm working on right now, is sort of digitizing all of these. So on the left-hand side, you can see my immediate family. That's my grandmother, my great aunts, my great grandmother, my uncle, my other uncle, and my cousin and godmother. And then on the right-hand side are my grandparents, Nan and Papa, in their house in Yardley, Pennsylvania. And that's my grandfather, who grew up right near the swamp that I was referencing at the beginning of this talk. Okay, so let's talk about these masks that you've sort of seen hints of. I've talked about them. And again, they're referencing this history of practices of embodiment and performance that we see in Bahia and Candomblé and Igangan and Yoruba and so on and so forth, right? You can even just go to the Southeast, Louisiana, and you see these practices as well. And again, I see these as self-protective. I see them as utilitarian. They are not just art objects. I believe in what they can do for me in terms of this ancestral force. And I don't make them for others, right? I make them to wear for myself. Really trying to be aware, mindful, and respectful of the fact that there are people who are ordained in these practices and can make them for others. And I am not that person, and that's okay. But I can practice ancestor worship, right? That is something that I have access to. So I started making these in 2019. And that is something I'm going to be working on while I'm here in Texas, is trying to continue this body of work and make progress while I am here. When I first started making these, I was referencing different sort of images or motifs that I noticed reoccurring during my time in Bahia in 2018 when I went there for a research trip / school program. And now I'm sort of working more intuitively, as I continue on with this body of work. And these are the first two masks that I made on the screen here. But they all sort of follow a similar process in terms of making. So this is how I make them. So this is not a full demo, but this gives you a sense, if you're interested in making your own mask, of how I do it. I use this mesh interfacing. I cut it out to be the size that I need. There's no, right or wrong way in terms of size. And then I use a sort of silky backing. And then I cut out the silky backing and sort of draw a guide that I'll be using. I often sort of veer away from the guide and let myself work intuitively. But it's nice to have it there. And then in the final image, you can sort of see in progress. And so people always ask, can you see when you have those masks on? The answer is yes. What I see is that mesh interfacing, right? But that was the beauty of wearing these in the natural light for the first time, is instead of seeing the mesh interfacing, it was like looking through a kaleidoscope, right? All of these pinholes of color. And so when I said I knew I wasn't alone, even though I had no audience, that was sort of my sign, so to speak. That was my first experience of wearing the masks and having that experience. And I really am trying to figure out how to share that with others, right? Whether it's, trying to render that view that I have when wearing the mask in natural light through printmaking or papermaking or video, I don't yet know, but it is one of the goals for the upcoming show in November. And then lastly, some new work in progress, and what I'm working on here in Texas is a dye project. If you guys are interested in dyeing, I can give you a few tips, but I just use different buckets for each of my color. I use Proxium MX dye, which is a cold water dye. You can use that dye in combination with salt to get a more saturated color. I didn't do that. I just soaked my dyes with the cold water. I started off with natural cotton fiber and natural cotton yarn. And I eventually have cut these. I'm about halfway done because there's 32 yards. It's a lot of fabric, you guys. I'm using this to create rugs. So I'm cutting these into strips, 2.5 inch by 4 feet long strips that I'm going to braid and turn into sort of bath mat sized oval rugs. And I'm also, as I braid these strips together, I'll be braiding in different objects into the rug, referencing back to that history of Black people enslaved or otherwise, braiding things into their hair for safekeeping, for protection, etc. And then my very last thing for you, tomorrow, November 16th, I'm very excited. I've been a part of Prints for Protest since I was in graduate school. And it's an organization I started with my cohort when I was in school after the 2016 election. And we do an annual print collection supporting a variety of different organizations, always selected by the participating artists. And the collection is launching tomorrow. So if you're interested, this is my contribution. It's an edition of 25 prints. They were hand printed in my studio at the Atlanta Contemporary. It's a 4-color print, and it's referencing Octavia Butler. And my favorite affirmation from her that comes from her journal, so be it, see to it. So that will be available tomorrow, along with so many other 14 other beautiful editions. So just to put that on your radar. And they're $35 a print. So that is the story. I know that was really a quick rundown of what's going on in my practice at the moment, but I would love to answer any questions, or if there's things that y'all would like me to expand upon. I know I was sort of quick. I am happy to do that.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you
Hi.
for your presentation. Such beautiful work.
Thank you.
From marronage to masquerade, I'm curious to hear from you what opacity means, and also how does it function in your work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I hate to do this, but I almost am curious what you think about opacity, because I'm not sure that that's something, to be honest with you, that I consider much in my practice beyond, thinking about opacity when it comes to research, to be honest, and sort of, not being opaque in how I think about reference points, but really being sort of vocal, at least when I speak to the work. I don't think those reference points are immediately legible, which I'm comfortable with, immediately legible to everyone. I do think that there's sort of links there for people with this knowledge that's prior held or inherent, right, to sort of grasp. But I do think it's incredibly important for me to be direct, transparent, about the origins of this. And that's why I even say over and over again, if you hear me talk about my work, right, that I'm making this for me, these masks, these objects. I don't have the capacity or the sort of relationship to these communities to make them for others, right? And so really trying to acknowledge that, but also allow myself to sort of release from what I really think are these colonial expectations to sort of designate, what lane you're allowed to access as a person of color or a Black person, really trying to look into history or lineage, et cetera. So I'm sorry, I don't know if I totally addressed your question, but in interpreting, that's where I landed.
No, totally. I mean, these traditions have, as you spoke of, they have roots in need for protection and wanting to evade an oppressive gaze or, a desire to preserve. And so,
absolutely,
those are the things that I'm picking up on. Yes, and I think when you speak about like the winks, I think I feel those, that those are very specific. And I think that's where the opacity kind of comes up for me. Like, even if you are very generously, taking us through your work, your material, your inspirations, there is still a level that is not easily accessed, right? That kind of requires a bit of work.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad that you said that, because I'm interested in asking people to do that work. I was watching a video with my students probably a few weeks back, a Kerry James Marshall interview with my students at Spelman College, and he said something that I was like, oh, I feel exactly the same way. He said, it takes intelligence and time and research to create art. Why would it not be the same experience to view it, right? And so I'm not trying to make my work inaccessible at all, right? I really want to have conversations. I want to invite people in, but I also want people to do the work if they so choose, right? To sort of consider these practices of ancestor worship for themselves. So thank you. I appreciate the questions and what you said. We're on the same page.
Oh, no, thank you.
I have a question for you, Kelly.
Sure.
It's mostly to do with, you mentioned you want your work to be accessible. I want to know what that means, who is able to have access to your work. It is very intimate. It is about your ancestral lineage. Are there people of different labels and ethnicities that should not have access to that? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said earlier, and this was something that someone said to me after I was talking about some sort of anxiety or fear I have around the work, but, they reminded me, it's like, everybody has ancestors, right? Whether or not they think about that or have a connection to that or are interested in, everyone has that. So I'm not, of the party that feels like this work is for these people, not for these people. But I do think, as mentioned in this conversation, that there are winks that are going to be legible to some people and not to others. And that is intended, right? And I'm comfortable with that, and I'm okay with that. But I also think that there is room for everyone in this work, but I also think there needs to be acknowledgement that these cultures and histories that I am referencing, utilizing, amalgamating, are of the diaspora, right? They are of certain peoples. And so I do think if people go on this journey on their own, they should be sure that they're being as thoughtful as I'm doing my best to be, you know, thinking about these reference points and how they are treading lightly, right? And not, you know, claiming ownership or access to something that is not theirs to claim, right? And I think that that's something only an informed person can decide for themselves, right? I can't do that for other people. But I hope that answers the question, Nisa.
It does answer the question. And it's also, again, there's a responsibility on the artist to do the research and on the viewer of the art to be doing the research. It's not
exactly
one-off experience. And I think as I've interacted with your work in Slither space and now in Shoot space, it is made clear when you all, the patrons, come visit the space and Shoot space, you will be able to interact with it and walk around it. And that's the purpose of it, because I don't think understand ancestral work if you're not looking through nooks and crannies and squinting and portals make the most sense and have the easiest passage for you as an individual.
Right.
So thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
I encourage you all to check out Kelly's work at our exhibition, or in our exhibition currently in Shoot Space. It will close January 31st of 2021. And then, as she mentioned, in November, she will have her exhibition with Mocha GA. So please be on the lookout for all of those glorious, amazing things. Other than that, enjoy Texas, Kelly, and thank y'all.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time. I hope you have a wonderful Sunday.
All right. Bye.
Bye.